Cole Hartley's aunt set his duffel on the porch the morning of the funeral, slid the deadbolt behind it, and told him through the glass that Walt's money was hers now, $11 and his grandfather's folded bar rag, the only things he carried down the steps. "It's all mine now, Cole," Brenda Voss said through the storm door, not loud the way people say a thing they decided days ago. "The house, the accounts, the lot at the lake. You were a guest here. Guests leave." She had the inventory exactly backward, and it would take her 3 weeks in a courthouse to find out. The part she locked behind that door was the part the family wanted. The part she set out on the porch in a canvas duffel was the part that mattered. 5 miles down Route 11W, behind a bar the whole county had already written off as junk, Walt Hartley had left his grandson the one thing he had ever really owned. Cole didn't know that yet. He knew it was cold for June, that his hands were empty, and that the man who would have fixed both was in the ground by 10 that morning. They had been clearing the house since dawn. Garrett ran it like a closing clipboard against his forearm, while 2 men he'd hired carried out the walnut chairs and the silver service Walt never once used, and the keys to the Ford. Cole stood in the hall and watched them take a life apart in inventory order. He took 2 things. He opened the kitchen drawer where the bar rag lived, the grey cloth gone soft from 40 years of wiping down oak, folded it into a neat square, and put it in his jacket. Then he lifted the bottle count notebook off the shelf by the door, the one with the taped spine that Walt carried to the whistle stop every night of his life, and slid that into his pocket too. One of the hired men glanced at him. Garrett didn't even do that. "Leave him be," Garrett said, not looking up from the clipboard. "He's carrying out the trash for us." A couple of people thought that was funny. Cole had earned both things, not that earning entered into it for them. Every Sunday since he was 9, he'd ridden out to the Roadhouse with Walt and restocked the shelves, counting the bottles down to the last inch of bourbon, calling the numbers, while the old man wrote them in that notebook in his slow, careful hand. Cole could recite the whistle stop's inventory with his eyes shut. He knew which porch board had the give in it. The one thing he couldn't account for was why his aunt was looking at him through a door his grandfather had never once locked against him. He didn't argue. There was no version of arguing that ended with Walt alive again, so he let it lie. On his way down the steps, he stopped at the porch sign, the small carved one that read Hartley in letters Walt had rooted out himself one winter, and saw it had slipped crooked on its nail. Cole reached up and set it square. Then he shouldered the duffel and walked, and behind him the house his family had won went quiet. Ewell, Tennessee was 3 stoplights strung along the highway under Clinch Mountain, the kind of town where the mountain decided what time the sun came up and what time it gave up. Everybody in Ewell had known Walt. Half of them had a stool they still considered theirs at the whistle stop, back when the neon buzzed and the lot filled with pickups on a Friday night. They'd buried him that morning under a sky the colour of dishwater. Cole had stood at the edge of it in a borrowed tie and looked at the middle distance instead of the grave, because some things a man steps around so he can keep walking. So he kept walking. The will was read at 2, in the office of a lawyer named Pruitt, above the hardware store on Main. Cole nearly didn't go. He had no reason to think Walt had left him anything past the rag already in his pocket. But Pruitt's girl had called the church and said the boy's name was in it. So Cole sat in a folding chair against the back wall, while the Vosses filled the good seats up front like a jury that had already returned its verdict. It went fast, the way it goes when the family has done its dividing in advance. Pruitt read it flat. The house on Cedar Street to Brenda. The savings, what there were of them, to Brenda. The lake lot off Highway 70 to Brenda and Garrett jointly. Garrett ticked each line on his clipboard with a small, satisfied mark, a man matching the read against a list he'd written days before. You know the type. Calls it diligence when it is only appetite in a good shirt. Then Pruitt turned a page, and his voice dropped a half step. "To my grandson, Cole Hartley," he read, "I leave the option to purchase the property, known as the Whistle Stop, at the county line on Route 11W, for the sum of $5. The room laughed. Not all of it, but enough. Garrett laughed once through his nose. Brenda smiled the smile of a woman watching a problem solve itself. The Whistle Stop. Condemned. Asbestos in the ceiling, a failed inspection nailed to the door, 4 years of back taxes the county had already threatened to foreclose. Garrett had a word ready. $5, he said, loud enough to share around. The boy's overpaying. He believed it too. Garrett Voss was a partner at Voss and Pell Development, and he wore the easy ease of a man who already knew what next year looked like. They'd signed earnest money on the lake house that very week, set against money they were certain was coming. To Garrett, the line about the Roadhouse was a dead mouse the cat had dragged in, a liability, a punchline at the tail of a will that had just made him a wealthy man. Pruitt wasn't done. He cleared his throat, and the last part he read slower. Because even a lawyer can feel when the words in a document are meant for one person in the room. And to that grandson I leave these words, to be read aloud. I didn't leave you a Roadhouse, Cole. I left you the only key that matters. You'll find it where you used to count the bottles. Quiet for about a second. Long enough for every face in the room to decide it meant nothing. Sentimental, Garrett said, and capped his pen. To a man like Garrett, a sentence that moved no money was just noise an old man made on his way out. He was already standing, already shrugging into his coat, but Cole had heard it, where you used to count the bottles. He got up from the folding chair, crossed to Pruitt's desk, took his grandfather's $11 out of his jacket, and counted 5 ones onto the green blotter. I'll take it, he said. The Roadhouse. I want to buy it now. Garrett paused at the door, one hand on the frame, almost amused. Go ahead and sign for it, son, he said. By fall, that whole bend of 11W is going to be the state's headache. Not yours. Buy yourself a ruin. He didn't wait to watch Cole's face. Men like Garrett rarely did. Pruitt looked at the boy, then at the bills, then over at Brenda. She flicked her hand like she was shooing a fly off a plate. Oh, let him, she said. Saves us the cost of the teardown. So Pruitt drew up a 1-page transfer on the spot, and Cole signed his name under Waltz. And just like that, with $6 left in the world, a 22-year-old who'd been set out on a porch at sunrise owned a condemned bar on Route 11W. The room was sure it had watched him lose. The room was not paying attention. The whistle stop sat where the highway bent at the county line, right under the shoulder of Clinch Mountain. Neon dead, porch sagging at one end like a tired man leaning on a rail. Cole walked the 2 miles out with the duffel on his shoulder. Because the Ford keys belonged to Brenda now. The nearer he got, the more the place looked like exactly what they'd all called it. Plywood over one window, weeds standing in the gravel, a padlock he could open only because the key had hung on Walt's ring. Across the highway in the gravel turnout where nobody ever parked, sat a grey sedan. One man behind the wheel, maybe 2, Cole couldn't tell through the windshield glare. He noticed it the way a man notices anything that doesn't belong, and then he let it go, because a man with $6 has heavier questions than who is idling on Route 11W on a Tuesday afternoon. The sedan didn't move. Cole turned the key and went in. The dark folded around him, and the smell reached him first, the way it always had. Bourbon and floor wax and 40 years of cold wood smoke. The smell of the only home that had ever felt like one. The stools stood upside down on the bar where Walt had left them the last night he locked up. Dust lay over all of it, like the room had been holding its breath, waiting. Cole set the duffel on a table, found the broom in the corner where it had stood his whole life, and began to sweep, because his hands needed something honest to do, and a floor is honest. He swept the length of the room to the bar. Then he did the thing he had done 1,000 Sundays without being asked. He stepped behind it, into the narrow run where he'd stood as a boy with a clipboard and a flashlight, and he began to count the bottles, out of habit, out of grief some. Count it twice, Walt used to say, leaning in the doorway with his coffee gone cold in his hand. A bottle you don't count is a bottle that walks off on its own legs. So Cole counted it twice, calling the numbers low into the empty room, 41 on the top row, same as the last Sunday the old man was alive to hear them, and his knuckles brushed the cedar. The back wall of the bar was cedar, close-fitted panels Walt always said a fellow had built for him, a long way back. Good, tight work nobody bothered with anymore. Cole had leaned against that wall 10,000 times. But his hand, falling from the shelf, caught an edge his memory had no record of, a thin seam running with the grain where one panel met the next, and the wood under his fingers gave. A little. A 1/4 inch of travel where solid cedar had no business moving at all. Cole went still. Out across the highway, the grey sedan's engine turned over once and settled back to quiet. He set his palm flat against the panel and pressed, and somewhere behind the cedar, in the dark his grandfather had built, something shifted. The panel did not swing. It slid, A hand's width of cedar travelled sideways along a track no eye would ever find unless the fingers found it first, and behind it opened a dark deeper than the room, a squared-off pocket built into the wall where the back of the bar had no business being anything but solid oak the whole way through. Cole crouched down. He reached up to the shelf and took the flashlight, the same dented flashlight he had held 1,000 Sundays calling the top row, and he thumbed it on and put the beam into the gap. Steel looked back at him. A box, grey steel, about the size of a tackle kit, sitting flush on a little ledge of its own inside the cavity, so square to the world that a man had measured twice before he cut. The dust lay thinner in there than it lay anywhere else in the building, thin the way it goes on a thing that gets handled more than the air around it. Cole stayed very still for a moment, the way you go still when a quiet room turns out to have been keeping something from you the whole time you thought you knew it. Then he set the flashlight on the bar with the beam pointed up, reached in with both hands, and lifted. It came heavy. Not tool heavy. Heavy the way paper gets when there is enough of it stacked together. A dense, settled weight that did not slosh or rattle but pressed down honest into his palms. He drew it out of the wall slow, mindful of the edges, and set it on the oak in the grey afternoon light coming through the one window that wasn't boarded. Across the highway the grey sedan was still there. Cole had stopped looking at it, but the engine ticked over again now. Low, the sound of a car that has been sitting long enough to need to clear its throat, and a man's shape behind the glass leaned a little toward the windshield, as if the angle through the dirty pane had gotten suddenly worth the effort. Cole didn't see it. His whole world had narrowed to a steel box and the latch on the front of it. The latch wasn't locked. A simple hasp, the kind you put on a feed bin, folded down over a staple with a cotter pin, run through it to keep it honest. Walt's doing. That pin. The man padlocked the front door of a bar nobody wanted, and trusted a cotter pin with whatever this was, because he knew the only hands that would ever get this far were hands he'd taught to count. Cole worked the pin loose, lifted the hasp, and raised the lid. The first thing the light found was brass. A key. Long and old and heavier than a key has any business being, the kind cut for a real lock, a lock with weight on the other side of it. It lay across the top of everything on a square of that same soft grey cloth, a twin to the bar rag folded in Cole's jacket. That very minute. Like Walt had wrapped the thing, the way he wrapped everything that mattered, in a rag worn down by work. Under the key, a ledger, canvas bound, taped at the spine, the dead spit of the bottle notebook in Cole's pocket. Except this one was fat with years, and the canvas had gone dark at the corners, where a thumb had opened it 1,000 times. And under the ledger, flat against the bottom of the box, an envelope. Cole lifted the key off first and held it in the light, and it was warm by the time he had held it 10 seconds, the way brass takes the heat right out of your hand and gives you nothing back. He didn't know yet what it opened. He set it on the bar. Then he moved the ledger aside, careful, and he looked down at the envelope, and the afternoon went quiet around him, in a way the wind outside had nothing to do with. One word on the front, in pencil, in a hand he would have known in the pitch dark, in a hand that had written 41 on the top row every Sunday of his life. Cole. That was the moment the building stopped being a building Cole had bought for $5 and became something else. A man can stand a great deal. He can stand a deadbolt sliding home behind his duffel, and a room full of his own people laughing at a will, and the long walk out a highway with no truck, because the truck belongs to his aunt now. He had stood all of it that day, with his face set on the middle distance and his feet moving, the way Walt had taught him, without ever once saying it out loud. But there is no setting your face against your own name in a dead man's pencil. Cole put one hand flat on the bar to keep it under him, and he let his head go down. And for a little while the only sound in the whistle stop was a young man breathing careful and even, the way you breathe when you have decided you are not going to come apart in a room with the windows boarded. Then he picked up the envelope and he opened it, because Walt had not hidden a thing behind a false wall for 40 years, so his grandson could stand over it and grieve. He'd hidden it so the boy would read it. The paper inside was bar stationery, the cheap kind from a box Walt bought once in the 80s and never finished. Whistle Stop printed faint across the top, with a phone number that hadn't rung in years. The writing filled both sides, slow and careful, and pressed deep. A man taking his time because he knew he only got to say it the one way. Cole, it read. If you are holding this, then I am where I was always headed, and you are where I always knew you'd be. Which is behind the bar with your sleeves up, counting what's mine when everybody else has already gone home thinking they took it. I am sorry about the morning. I knew the shape of it, and I couldn't change it from where I'm sitting now, and I figured a clean wound from your aunt's hand would heal faster than a slow one. So I let her have the swing. She will take the house. Let her. She will take the lake lot and the silver and the truck, and she will feel like she won. And you will let her feel it, because a man who knows what he's holding doesn't need the room to clap. I told them at the table I didn't leave you a Roadhouse. I left you the only key that matters, and you'd find it where you used to count the bottles. The lawyer read that out, and I'd bet the whole place laughed. Let them laugh, son. The laugh is yours now. You just don't get to collect it yet. Cole read it twice. Count it twice, the old man's voice said somewhere under his ribs. A bottle you don't count is a bottle that walks off on its own legs. And Cole almost smiled, except his eyes were doing something that made smiling hard. The letter went on, and the next part it stopped being only a grandfather talking to a boy, and turned, careful, into a man handing over the keys to something with weight on the far side of the lock. The ledger tells the rest, Walt had written. Read it from the front and don't skip, the way I taught you to take inventory. One line at a time, because if you jump to the back, you'll think it's a lie. It isn't. Every line in there I bought with my own 2 hands, across 40 years. Quiet, under a name that isn't Hartley, so nobody in this county would ever think to look at a broke barkeep twice. The brass key is the last of it. It doesn't open a door. It opens the floor. Lift the rubber mat where you stand to pour, and you'll see where. Take Hollis Greer with you when you do. He built the back you just opened 40 years back, and he swore to me on a handshake he'd never say what went behind it to a living soul until you were the one asking. Go ask him. The old fool's been waiting longer than you have. There was one more line, set off by itself at the bottom of the second page. Smaller, like Walt had stood up from the table and then sat back down because he wasn't quite done. You were never a guest in my house, Cole. You were the only one in it who ever belonged. Square the sign on your way out and come count what's ours. Cole folded the letter along the creases Walt had already put in it and held it a minute against the rag in his jacket, the 2 soft things together. Then he set it down and he opened the ledger to the front because the man had told him not to skip, and a man does not start ignoring Walt Hartley the same hour he finds out how much Walt Hartley had been right about. The first page was dated 40 years back. A single line, that slow, careful hand. A parcel number. A name across from it that wasn't Hartley. Renfro Trust, the heading said at the top of the page, blocked out in Walt's block letters, and underlined twice, and below it a column of parcel numbers running down the sheet, each with a date and a figure beside it. Small figures, the kind of money a man scrapes off the top of a bar, one good season at a time. Cole turned the page. More numbers, more parcels. The same name holding the top of every sheet, like a roof over the whole thing. He didn't understand it yet. Not the size of it. Not what a parcel number on Route 11W was worth to a man in a grey sedan who had been sitting across the highway since before Cole walked up. He only understood that his grandfather, who poured cheap bourbon for truckers and counted his bottles by flashlight and got buried that morning under a dishwater sky while his daughter changed the locks, had been doing something out here for 40 years that filled a canvas ledger to bursting and had a stranger watching the building to see who'd come for it. The parcel numbers ran on, page after page of them, climbing the years. And somewhere in the middle of them, without quite deciding to, Cole stopped reading them as a list and started reading them as a map. And the map was the highway. His highway, the bend at the county line, the corridor of scrub and gravel and right-of-way running both directions from the whistle stop's own front door, mile on mile of it, every parcel a line in a dead barkeep's careful hand. He was still bent over it, turning pages slower and slower, when a knuckle rapped twice on the boarded front door, and an old man's voice came through the wood, rough and certain, like it had been saving itself up the whole 40 years for exactly this. Boy, it said, you found the back, didn't you? I heard it slide from the road. Cole closed the ledger over his thumb to keep his place. Out across the highway, the grey sedan's door had opened, and a second man was standing now in the gravel, with something flat and pale, held up in both hands, a clipboard or a plat map, turning it to catch the last of the light. Cole crossed the dark room he owned and put his hand on the door. His grandfather had never once locked against him, and he opened it on the man Walt had told him to go find, who had saved Cole the walk by coming himself. Hollis Greer stood on the sagging porch, in a canvas coat too warm for June, a carpenter's hands hanging out of the cuffs, knuckles swelled with the years, and his eyes went past Cole's shoulder to the dark run behind the bar where the cedar stood open. And the old man's face did something complicated and quiet. The look of a man seeing a promise he made in his prime finally come due in his old age. 40 years I kept my mouth shut, Hollis said. Walt said one day a Hartley would open that wall and have questions. He looked at the boy and then at the steel box on the bar, and the brass key beside it catching the light. You'd be the one with the questions. I'd be him, Cole said. Hollis Greer stepped over the threshold, set one swelled hand flat on the bar like he was greeting it, and looked down the length of the oak to where the floor mat lay under the spot a man stood to pour. Then pull up that mat, he said, and let's see if your grandfather was the fool this whole county took him for, or the smartest man any of us ever poured a drink for and never knew it. I built him the back. I never once saw the floor. He nodded at the brass key, that part he kept even from me. Cole came around the end of the bar and Hollis Greer came with him, the old carpenter moving slow on a hip that had carried him 40 years, past the day he cut that cedar. The mat lay where it had always lain, a black rubber runner gone grey with the scuff of 10,000 Sunday boots. The spot where a man stood to pour worn so deep into the pine that the boards beneath it had gone a shade paler than the boards to either side. Cole had stood on that mat as a boy on an upturned milk crate, too short to reach the well, handing Walt bottles one at a time and calling the numbers up to him. He crouched now and took the near edge of the runner in both hands and peeled it back, and the smell of old rubber and older spilled liquor came up off the floor at him. And under the mat was the floor. Only the floor. Pine board run straight and true, the way Hollis Greer ran every line he ever set. Don't look for a door, Hollis said behind him. Soft. A door a man can find. Walt didn't want a door, so Cole didn't look for a door. He did the thing the old man had taught him to do with everything in his life, which was to quit looking and start counting. He laid his palm flat against the boards and went along them one at a time, board and seam, the way you go down a shelf calling inventory. And on the fifth board in from the cooler, his thumb dropped into a knothole that was not a knothole. It was round and clean and cut a little too deep, and down at the bottom of it, when he worked his thumbnail under, there was metal. A keyway, turned up out of the floor to face the ceiling, set into a plate of steel, laid flush beneath the pine and scuffed and stained to match it. Invisible from standing height, invisible from kneeling, invisible to anything in this world, but a hand that already knew the floor, the way Cole's hand knew it. He fit the brass key down into the floor, and it went home with the heavy, oiled certainty of a lock that somebody had been keeping up, somebody who had come out here, in the dark on the Sundays. Cole always thought the old man was only closing. And he turned it, and a square of floor he would have sworn his life was solid, let go along seams, no eye had been meant to find, and lifted on a hinge built never to be seen. What came up out of the floor was cool. That was the first of it, the breath of air off the dark below. Cellar cool and dry the way a place is only dry when a man has gone to real trouble about keeping it so. A box again, but built in this time, a steel chamber the size of a footlocker set down into the joists in a bed of poured concrete, and Hollis Greer made a low sound in his throat at the sight of it, because the concrete was the one part even he had never known. Somebody had come in the night and poured a vault into the floor of the bar he framed with his own hands, and he had never once caught wind of it. Lord Walt, the old man said, to nobody, to the dead. Inside, on top, lay more of the grey cloth. Walt had wrapped everything that ever mattered to him in the same soft worn rag, and there was a thing in Cole's chest about that he did not have the room to feel just yet. He lifted the cloth away. Under it the bonds lay in banded stacks, paper gone the cream colour, old paper goes, engraved borders and dollar figures struck deep into the stock. Bearer bonds, the kind of certificate that belongs to whatever hand is holding it, and asks that hand no further questions. There were more of them stacked down in that cool dark than Cole had ever believed sat in one place in the whole world, let alone under the floor of a roadhouse that nobody in Yule would slow the truck for. And beneath the bonds, set into a flat steel tray of their own, the deeds. They were folded in thirds the way deeds are folded, on heavy stock, and across the head of every one of them ran the same 3 words Cole had been reading all afternoon down the pages of the ledger. Renfro Trust. and in the corner of each one sat the thing that made Hollis Greer take his hat off without seeming to know his hand had done it. A stamp, purple ink gone faint with the years, a date, a book number and a page number, and run in a circle around the county seal, the words, "Recorded Ewell County, Tennessee." Not a promise, not a handshake, not a backroom paper a smooth man in a good suit could stand up and wave off in front of a judge. Recorded, filed at the courthouse on the square in Ewell, entered into the big bound books the law keeps for keeps, the very same books that said this morning that Brenda Voss now owned a house and a lake lot and an old man's truck. Every parcel along the bend of Route 11W, from the county line where the whistle stop sat, and running both directions out into the scrub, and the gravel, and the right-of-way, deeded over to the Renfro Trust and recorded under the seal of the county, season on season, going back near to the year Cole was born. Hollis turned one of them over in his swelled hands, the slow, careful way a man handles a thing in church. "You know what they mean to pay for this corridor," he said, and it was not a question. The state. For the interchange. He set the deed back down on the oak, gentle, in the grey light coming through the one window that wasn't boarded. Voss and Pell have had their signboard up on the south end better than a year. Garrett Voss has stood in the diner on the square and told men I have known my whole life what their daddy's land would be worth the day the off-ramp comes through. He looked at the boy. Over $2 million is the talk, son, for the run of it. More than the house, more than the lake lot, more than every nickel and stick those two carried out of Walt's place this morning, with their arms full, the whole of it stacked together, and then a good deal left over the top. And Cole stood behind his grandfather's bar with $2 million lying open at his feet. And he understood at last, all in the one breath, the size and the shape of the joke Walt Hartley had spent 40 years building. They had fought over the house, they had fought over the silver and the truck and the lake lot, and they had turned the Roadhouse loose for $5 to the boy out on the porch because the Roadhouse was a condemned tax liability, with bad walls and a failed inspection nailed to the door, the junk. And the whole reason the house and the lake lot and every other thing the Vosses now clutched was worth 1 minute of fighting over was that Garrett Voss's firm held a signed contract to sell the state of Tennessee a highway interchange, and that interchange could not be cut 1 foot of dirt, could not close $1 of money, without the land that ran the bend of Route 11W. The land Walt had been quietly gathering up under a dead woman's name for 40 years, and had hidden under the floor of the bar they laughed at across a lawyer's table. They had not seized the estate, they had seized everything around the estate, and they had handed the estate itself to Cole for the price of a tank of gas, and they had gone home to count their winnings by the lake. Out across the highway, the second man from the grey sedan had walked to the edge of the asphalt now. Cole caught him through the bare window as he straightened, a man in a windbreaker with a long cardboard tube under one arm and a flat pale rectangle held up in both hands, turning his head off the paper to the whistle stop and back to the paper again, squaring the one against the other. A plat map. The man was standing on the shoulder of Route 11W, reading parcels off a county map and matching the lines to the dirt in front of him. And he had not the first idea, not the ghost of one, that every line drawn on the paper in his hands had been recorded to a barkeep's trust and was lying open under a worn black mat 40 yards from where he stood. "That'll be there, man," Hollis said, tracking Cole's eyes out the glass. "Been parking that car out there better than a week. I took him for a fellow waiting on the condemnation to clear so they could send the dozers." He said the word condemnation, the way a man says the name of a sickness in the family. Walt's place failed its county inspection 2 springs back. On purpose, I have always believed. Though I never could square it with the Walt, I knew to think he'd let a thing of his fail on purpose. The county has it slated now for a tax sale. Brenda and that husband of hers have been down at the clerk's office, letting it be known they mean to buy the parcel clean out of that sale the day it comes up, clear the title and fold it into the corridor with the rest. He shook his head, slow. They believe this building is the last loose board in the whole floor. They believe the day they buy the whistle stop out of the tax sale, the corridor runs theirs from end to end, and the state writes the check. "Why Renfro?" Cole said. The name had sat at the head of every page of the ledger the whole long afternoon, and had meant not one thing to him. The old carpenter very near smiled. Renfro was Walt's mother's people. Your great-grandmother. Dead and buried before you drew breath. Before your Aunt Brenda was grown tall, He ran a thumb along the worn lip of the bar. Walt always said the surest way to hide a thing in a county, the size of this one, was to lay a dead woman's family name on the paper and stand a barkeep's face out front of it. Not a soul in Ewell ever once looked at Walt Hartley pouring well bourbon for truck drivers and thought, why, there stands the man buying up the whole of the highway. Why ever would they? He drove a truck older than you are. He counted his own bottles by hand of a night, so he'd not have to pay a boy a wage to do it. Hollis's voice caught just at the edge, and he covered it over by clearing his throat hard. He paid you, though. Sundays. You recall what the old man paid you? $3, Cole said, and all the cola I could hold. $3, Hollis said, out of a man with $2 million lying under the very floor you were standing on to drink it. He looked at the boy a long moment in the grey light. You see it now, don't you? Why he left the whole of it to you, and not to a one of them. They counted his money, son. You counted his bottles. There is a difference between the two, and Walt Hartley went into the ground knowing it down to the last decimal. Cole looked down at the open floor, at the banded paper and the recorded deeds in the soft grey rag laid over them, and then he did the thing Walt would have done in his place, which was the unhurried thing. He did not snatch it all up into his arms. He did not run for the truck he no longer had. He knelt at the lip of the vault and he took exactly one deed off the top of the steel tray, the one cut for the parcel. The whistle stop itself stood upon, the home parcel, the bend of the highway where the whole of it began, and he folded it back, along the creases already worn into it, and he slid it down inside the bottle notebook in his jacket, in against the rag, the small things and the great things together. Then he laid the grey cloth back over the rest of it, the way you tuck a thing in for the night, and he lowered the floor, and he turned the brass key, and the vault went back to being pineboard worn pale by Sunday boots. First thing come morning, he said. I go to the courthouse. First thing come morning, Hollis agreed. You walk into the clerk on the square, and you pull that record with your own two eyes so that no man living can ever stand in front of you and tell you it is not there. The old man settled his hat back down onto his head. And between now and then you say nothing to nobody. Not at the diner, not after church, not to a living soul. You let Brenda Voss and that husband of hers walk grinning into the tax sale. You let them go on believing the last loose board is theirs. He nodded at the dark run of wall, at the open cedar, at the steel box sitting up on the oak. Walt waited 40 years to be proved right out loud. You can surely wait the few more days it takes to let him do it. Across the highway, the man with the plat map rolled it up and fed it back into the cardboard tube and folded himself into the grey sedan. And the engine caught, and the car pulled out onto Route 11W and ran south toward the town, toward the square, toward Voss and Pell's signboard, standing on the far end of the corridor, carrying a map of land it did not own back to the men who were already out spending it. Cole watched the tail lights shrink and go. Then he picked up the dented flashlight off the bar, and out of 40 years of Sunday habit, because the counting was the one thing in all his life that had never one time lied to him, he turned and laid the beam up onto the top row, and he called the number low into the empty room, the way he had called it 10,000 times before. 41. Same as the last Sunday the old man was alive to hear it. He held the light there a moment on the dusty glass steady, and the boarded roadhouse held its quiet around him. And for the first time since his aunt slid the deadbolt home behind his duffel that morning under the dishwater sky, Cole Hartley was not the one in the family who had lost. He slept that night on the army cot behind the bar with the dented flashlight still in his hand, and he woke before the grey over Clinch Mountain had taken on any colour at all, and he washed his face in the cold tap and folded the rag back into its square and put it in his pocket, the way he put it there every morning of his life now. And then he walked the 11 miles of Route 11W into Ewell, because the truck was a Voss truck now, and he would sooner walk. Hollis Greer met him on the square in his church coat and his good hat, the two of them standing on the cold courthouse stone, while the town came awake around them, the diner lights buzzing on, a man rolling up the awning over the hardware, and when the deputy clerk turned the bolts from the inside at 8 o'clock, Cole Hartley was the first living soul through the door. The recorder's office was a long room that smelled of floor paste and old ink, and behind the oak counter, the walls went up in shelves of the great bound books, ledgers as tall as a car door, brown and green spines stamped in gold with the years and the volume numbers, every deed and lien and marriage and death the county had thought worth keeping since before the railroad came. The clerk was a heavy, patient woman, with reading glasses on a chain, and she took the book number and the page. Cole read her off the home parcel deed, and she did not hurry. She went down the shelf with one finger, the way a person goes down a row of headstones, and she drew the volume out with both arms for the weight of it, and laid it open on the slant of the counter, and turned the stiff pages over until she came to the one. There, she said, and set her finger under it, and turned the book to face him. Renfro Trust. That's a recording, hun. Stamped and booked. She looked at him over the top of her glasses, mild as milk, with no idea on this earth what she was handing him. Some of these along here go back better than 20 years. Whoever held this paper kept his taxes paid clean as a whistle. On the most of it, too, right up until that one corner lot, out at the county line. Cole leaned over the great book and read it with his own two eyes the way the old man would have made him. The parcels ran down the page one after another in the dry surveyor's language of rods and bearings, and points of beginning, the whole bend of the highway laid out in iron and stone, every one of them deeded over to the Renfro Trust and pressed with the faint purple county stamp, recorded Ewell County, Tennessee, the date booked beside it in a clerk's hand from years Cole had been a child. And down at the foot of the instrument that raised the trust under the legal print, the line that named who took it up when the maker was gone, successor trustee, Cole Hartley. And beneath the typed letters of his own name, in the careful upright hand he had last seen on a soft grey envelope under the floor, Walt Hartley had signed his name, and a witness had signed beside him, and the notary had crimped her seal through the paper, so that the little blind star of it stood up off the page when Cole ran his thumb across it. He stood there a long moment with his hat in his hand and did not trust his voice, and Hollis Greer put one swelled carpenter's hand on the boy's shoulder and left it there and said nothing at all. "You'll want certified," the clerk said, already reaching for the copier, kind the way clerks are kind to a young man gone quiet over a dead man's name. $2 the page. He paid her out of the $11. He had 7 left when he folded the certified copies flat against the rack in his jacket, and he thanked her by her counter, and he and the old carpenter walked back out into the daylight, and he said nothing to a living soul. Not at the diner where Garrett Voss's signboard partners took their coffee, not on the square, not to the men who had known him since he was knee-high. He let Ewell go on, believing exactly what it believed. He let the grey sedan keep its watch across the highway. He went home to the dark roadhouse and he swept it, and he counted the bottles, 41 on the top row, and he waited the way the old man had taught him to wait, which is the hardest counting there is. They came on a Thursday, 4 days before the tax sale, and they came in 3 vehicles. Cole was behind the bar with the steel box sitting up on the oak in front of him when the gravel crunched and the doors began to slam out front. He heard his aunt's heels first on the porch boards, brisk and certain, and then the door he had propped open let them in, out of the white afternoon. Brenda Voss in a town coat with a folder under her arm, Garrett Voss behind her, in his good grey suit with his partner Pell at his shoulder, and behind the two of them, ill at ease in the doorway with his hard hat in his hands, the man in the windbreaker from the sedan, and one more after them, a lean man in a state agency jacket with a clipboard and an easy, unhurried way about him, a right-of-way agent named Mercer, who had driven up from the capital to walk the corridor his employer was preparing to buy. "You've had your fun, Cole," Brenda said not unkindly, in the voice you use on a slow child. "The county sells this lot Monday on the courthouse steps for the back taxes, and we mean to buy it, and that is the end of it. I came out to let you take what's yours before the dozers come, which is more grace than you have earned." She set the folder on the bar. "There's a bus to Knoxville at 6. Garrett will run you to it." Garrett was not looking at Cole. Garrett was steering the statesman down the length of the dim barroom by the elbow, talking low and smooth, showing him the bones of the place. "Touchdown's right here at the bend, Mercer. Like I told your people, the off-ramp comes down off the grade and lands on this parcel. Here, the county line. Soon as we clear this last condemned corner out of the way Monday, your corridor runs clean from the interstate to the river, every foot of it under our paper, and you can take it to closing." He rapped his knuckles on the old bar top. "On the very wood. Junk like this is the only thing standing between the state and its interchange. 48 hours and it's gone." Cole did not raise his voice. He had never once in his life had to. He took the brass key out of the box and set it on the wood with a small flat click that stopped the room, and he opened the lid and he drew out the certified deed and the trust instrument, folded in their courthouse blue. And he did not slide them to his aunt, and he did not slide them to Garrett Voss. He slid them down the bar to Mercer, the one man in the room who answered to nobody at the table. "You'll want to read this before your state writes anybody a check," Cole said. "It's recorded." "I pulled it Monday with my own hand." Mercer set his clipboard down and unfolded the pages, and he read the way a man reads who reads land papers for his living, fast and then slow. And Cole watched the easy go out of his face. He turned to the second sheet. He looked up once at the great purple booking stamp and the notary's blind star standing off the page, and then he looked at Garrett Voss, and when he spoke it was quiet and it was final, and it carried into every corner of that boarded room. "Mr. Voss, this corridor is not yours to sell." He laid the deed flat on the bar and turned it so the firm could see the seal. "Every parcel on your plat, the Bend, the River Run, this lot we're standing on, all of it is deeded to the Renfro Trust and has been recorded down at that courthouse better than 20 years. The state pays on clear title or the state does not pay. There is no clear title here for Voss and Pell to deliver. There never was." He tapped the foot of the page, the successor line, the typed name and the upright signature under it. "The man who can sell the state of Tennessee this road is the man whose name is on this trust, and it is not anybody standing on your side of this bar." The man in the windbreaker came forward then, almost without meaning to, and bent over the deed. And Cole saw the recognition take him, saw him match the iron and stone on the courthouse page against the plat he had been walking for a week, and the colour climbed up out of his collar. "Mr. Voss," he said low, "these are the lines. These are the same lines off my plat. Somebody recorded every one of these parcels out from under us before we ever opened a file. It is a strange thing to watch a smooth man come apart slow." Garrett Voss did not shout. Garrett Voss picked up the deed and read it himself, and read it again, and his thumb went over the seal the way a man worries a sore tooth, and somewhere in the second reading, the whole tall architecture of it came down behind his eyes, the contract his firm had signed promising the state clear title to a corridor. It did not own by a closing date it could not meet. The breach of it. The earnest money he and Brenda had laid down on the lake house against a cheque that was never going to clear. The years of standing in the diner on the square, telling men what their daddy's land would be worth. He set the deed down very gently, as though it might go off. "This is a forgery," Brenda Voss said, but her voice had no flaw under it. "It's booked at the courthouse you sent me out of," Cole said. "Go read it. Volumes on the page in your hand." Garrett's phone went off in his coat then, loud in the dead quiet, and he looked at the face of it the way you look at a snake, and the name on the screen was the Lake House People, and he did not answer it, and that more than anything else in that room was the sound of it ending. He stepped out onto the porch to make a call he did not want made in front of his partner, and through the bare window, Cole watched him stand on the squared sign and talk fast with one hand pressed to his head, and Pell followed him out, and their two shapes drew apart on the gravel and did not come back together. Inside, Brenda Voss stood at the bar her father had built and looked down at the steel box and the brass key and the deed, at the worn grey rag folded by Cole's hand on the oak, and at last she understood what she had carried out of Walt Hartley's house, with her arms full and grinning on the morning of the funeral, which was the small half, the show half, the half that was only ever worth anything, because of what sat hidden under the floor of the junk she had laughed off for $5. She did not say she was sorry. She gathered her folder off the bar with hands that were not quite steady, and she went out to her husband on the gravel, and the three vehicles left the way they had come. Slower. Mercer stayed. He folded his clipboard under his arm, and he looked a long while at the boy behind the bar, and then he took a card out of his jacket and set it on the oak. "When you're ready to talk to the state about its road, Mr. Hartley," he said, "you call that number, and you call it your own self. Not a soul else." He touched his hat to Hollis Greer, the way you do to an old man you respect, and he went. Cole paid the back taxes on the whistle stop that Friday, with the first of the bonds, in cash, at the same counter where the heavy clerk had drawn the great book for him, and she struck the parcel off the Monday sale list with 2 lines of her pen, and stamped it redeemed, and never knew she was witnessing the whole turn of it. He recorded his own succession plain and open while he was there, so that no smooth man in any good suit could ever again stand in a room and call it a forgery. Then he went home and started the long work, and Hollis Greer came every morning in his work clothes now instead of his church coat, and put his old hands to the cedar he had hidden the truth inside of 40 years before, opening the walls back up to the light, planing the bar smooth, hanging the door true on hinges that did not sag. By fall, there was a boy from out the Sneedville Road who slept rough and had been put out of somewhere himself, and Cole hired him on to count the stock of an evening and paid him a fair wage in folding money and a plate of supper. And the first cold night the boy had nowhere to be, Cole did not slide a deadbolt on him. He gave him the cot behind the bar and the dented flashlight and the top row to learn, and stood in the doorway a while, listening to the low, even numbers called into the dark board and bottle, the oldest sound that building knew. On Route 11W, the new sign came on at dusk, red letters spelling Hartley's out into the long blue dark at the county line. Behind the lit glass, a boy walked the top shelf, counting.